They said Graceland had no more secrets left. Every room cataloged, every hallway photographed, every drawer documented. But when the archivists opened the one room Elvis Presley kept sealed, locked by his own order and untouched for nearly half a century, everyone in that hallway felt something shift. It wasn't excitement. It was a quiet shock, the kind that lands in your chest before your mind can understand it. The door didn't groan or resist. It simply released, almost as if it had been waiting. And the moment it swung inward, the first reaction wasn't spoken out loud. It echoed in the expressions on their faces. Confusion, awe, and something deeper, something like sadness. Because the room wasn't a vault of riches or memorabilia. It wasn't a treasure chest of lost recordings or secret deals. It felt more like stepping into a private mind, one Elvis spent years trying to protect. Letters stacked in careful piles. Pages covered in handwriting that looked rushed in some places and painfully slow in others. A reel-to-reel tape left at the edge of a desk. And a small wooden box with 4 words written by Elvis himself. "Do not open unless I'm gone." That single sentence changed the entire meaning of the room. It turned curiosity into reverence, speculation into grief. But the truth is, this room didn't begin as a secret. It began as a retreat, built during a period of Elvis's life when pressure didn't just surround him, it swallowed him. It grew out of moments he didn't share with family, friends, or even the people he trusted most. It was a place he didn't need to perform in, a place where he could finally be still. And yet he hid it. The question isn't just what Elvis kept here. The real question is, what was he trying to protect the world from seeing, and what part of himself was he trying to save? To understand why he locked away this room, we have to go back to a time when Elvis Presley, the man behind the legend, felt the world closing in, and the walls of Graceland becoming both a sanctuary and a cage. It began in the early 1970s, those complicated, contradictory years when Elvis stood at the height of global fame, yet felt more isolated than ever before. Graceland had always been his refuge, but something shifted in those years. Fame wasn't just a spotlight anymore. It was a shadow that followed him everywhere, even into the quiet corners of the home he loved. To the world, Elvis was unstoppable. Electrifying concerts, sold-out tour, iconic jumpsuits, and audiences who screamed like the first day he stepped onto a stage. But inside Graceland, Elvis was wrestling with something a crowd couldn't see. The weight of expectation. The thinning circle of people he truly trusted. The feeling that everyone wanted something from him, money, influence, a favor, a connection, except the part he needed most, honesty. He still laughed, still made jokes, still pulled pranks on the guys around him, but the quieter moments told the truth. Moments when Elvis sat alone in the jungle room long after everyone else had gone to bed. Moments when he paused mid-conversation, distracted by thoughts he couldn't shake. Moments when he wrote lines in notebooks he never showed anyone. This was a crossroads in his life. He'd already known betrayal, early managers who used him, business deals that cornered him, and trusting the wrong people at the wrong time. But as he entered the 1970s, the betrayals took on a sharper, more personal edge. Some came from people he cared for deeply, others came from people he never expected to hurt him. It wasn't the fame that drove him inward, it was the disappointment. Elvis began to realize that the more he gave, the more people took. And eventually, he needed a place where he could put the parts of himself he feared might get stolen too. That's when the idea of a private room started forming, not just a room he didn't show to visitors, but a room he didn't show to almost anyone. A room for writing, a room for breathing, a room for storing thoughts he couldn't say out loud. He chose a quiet section of Graceland, away from the main areas where people gathered. It was just another room at first, furnished simply with a desk, a chair, and some shelves. But little by little, it transformed into something more personal, something sacred. He began keeping letters there, fan letters that touched him, personal letters that wounded him, messages from people he lost, and notes he wrote but never sent. Some were apologies, some were confessions, some were reminders to himself of the dreams he still had but wasn't sure he could chase. He also kept small objects connected to memories he never discussed. A watch from someone he missed, a photo with half the image torn off, a piece of jewelry he once gave away and quietly asked to have returned. Each item was a story he wasn't ready to tell. But the most revealing part of that early room wasn't the objects, it was the writing. Elvis wrote constantly during those years, sometimes just a sentence or two, sometimes page after page until the morning light pushed through the curtains. These weren't songs, They weren't drafts. They were thoughts, raw, unfiltered, and painfully honest. He wrote about loneliness, about fear, about moments on stage when he felt like two different people, the performer and the man, fighting for control. He wrote about trust and how it felt harder to offer with every passing year. And he wrote about the kind of peace he wished he could find but never quite held on to. Those notes revealed something he rarely admitted. Elvis Presley, icon, superstar, legend, felt increasingly invisible in his own life. He wasn't hiding from the world. He was hiding from the parts of the world that refused to see him. As months passed, the room became more than a collection of private thoughts. It became a symbol of Elvis's need for control over at least one part of his life. For every arena he couldn't walk into without screaming fans, there was this one small room where silence finally existed. For every whisper from people who thought they knew what was best for him, there were these pages where he decided what he felt, without anyone's approval. But as the room grew more important, Elvis grew more guarded. He started locking it when people were around. He stopped mentioning its existence altogether. And slowly, he withdrew even further, not from people he loved, but from the versions of himself he felt pressured to be. His inner circle noticed the change. Some thought he was becoming distant. Others thought he was simply exhausted. A few wondered if something was troubling him more deeply than he let on. They were right, but they didn't know the extent. One night, after a particularly tense moment with someone he trusted, an argument that left him feeling betrayed in a way words couldn't express, Elvis walked into the room, closed the door, and made a decision that would define the room for the rest of his life. He would no longer treat it as a private space. He would treat it as a boundary. He locked the door, put the key in his pocket, and from that night forward he only opened it when he was alone. Even the people closest to him, the ones who spent nearly every waking hour by his side, never saw inside again. And he told just one trusted confidant something he'd never told anyone else. If anything happens to me, don't let them empty that room unless it's time. You'll know when. It was an instruction layered with fear, hope, regret, and something else. Something that wouldn't be understood until decades later, when the key finally turned in that lock again. The creation of that room wasn't an accident. It was a mirror of Elvis's hopes, his wounds, and the parts of himself he didn't want to disappear. And as the years unfolded, that locked door would come to represent something far more powerful than secrecy. It represented the last place where Elvis Presley was allowed to be human. And I'll continue the story with escalating tension, deeper betrayals, and emotional unraveling exactly as outlined. There's a certain kind of loneliness that doesn't show up in photographs. In the early 1970s, Elvis Presley looked like everything was bigger than ever. Bigger stages, bigger crowds, bigger shows. But behind each performance, there was a growing gap between the image the world adored and the man who went home to Graceland at night and closed himself into that one private room. The unraveling didn't happen all at once. It came in quiet pieces. It started with the small betrayals, the kind he almost convinced himself to ignore. A business advisor quietly pushing contracts that benefited everyone but him. Someone close to him leaking a story to the press that only a handful of people inside Graceland knew. A friend asking for help just one more time, promising it would be the last. The pattern was always the same. He gave, they took, and then they reached for more. On stage, Elvis was a force. The jumpsuit, the lights, the band hitting every note. He could feel the crowd's energy like a wave, and for a few moments it washed away everything else. But as soon as the show ended, the noise faded and the routine kicked in. The hotel room, the entourage, the meetings, the phone calls, the endless decisions that somehow never felt like his. When he returned to Graceland, that's when the silence hit him hardest. He would walk through his own house and hear echoes of laughter, conversations, footsteps, but those were from yesterday or last week or a tour long gone. The one sound that kept pulling his attention wasn't voices. It was the soft click of the lock on that hidden door. The room had started as a refuge. Now it was becoming something else, a witness. At first, he only kept notes and letters in there. But as the betrayals grew sharper, he needed more than written words. He needed to hear himself. Not the Elvis on stage, not the Elvis in interviews, the one no one else knew. So one night, after everyone had gone to sleep, Elvis carried a tape recorder into the room, set it on the desk, and pressed record. For a long moment, he said nothing. The tape captured only the sound of his breathing, steady but heavy. Then he began talking, not like a performer, not like a celebrity, but like a man who'd run out of places to put his thoughts. He talked about trust, how it felt like sand slipping through his fingers, names he wanted to believe in but wasn't sure he could, decisions he regretted, business deals, missed chances, words he'd left unsaid. He talked about love, the times he'd hurt people without meaning to, the times people hurt him and pretended they didn't, the pressure of trying to be everything for everyone while feeling like he was losing the parts of himself he needed most. And he talked about fear, not the kind that comes from facing a crowd, but the kind that shows up at 3 a.m. when you're alone and your mind won't let you sleep. Fear of being forgotten, fear of being misunderstood, fear that the world would only remember the spectacle and never the soul. When he stopped the tape, the room felt different, as if those walls now carried some of that weight with him. That first recording turned into a habit. After tough nights, arguments, or moments that cut deep, he would slip into the room, close the door, and press record. Some tapes held long reflections. Others held just a few words, spoken with a tired, cracking voice. But each reel held a piece of the Elvis no one saw. Outside that room, real-life cracks were forming. There were people in his life who seemed more invested in the machine around him than in his well-being. Schedules were packed tighter. Tour demanded more of him. The phrase, "it's too much," lingered on his tongue more often, but saying it out loud always came with pushback. There was always another show, another expectation, another reason he was told he had to keep going. Financial decisions were made in rooms he didn't always sit in. Legal documents that affected his future had pages and pages of language that blurred together when he tried to read them late at night. More than once, he had the sense that he was signing away pieces of control, even as people insisted they were taking care of everything for him. And then there were the emotional betrayals, confidences shared and later repeated, vulnerabilities turned into stories, people he thought would walk with him through anything, quietly shifting closer to the power, not the person. Each time something like that happened, Elvis returned to the hidden room. He began organizing the space more carefully, as if he were arranging not just objects but chapters of his life, letters on one shelf, tapes labeled with simple dates or one-word titles, fear, regret, mother, future, photos stacked in thin boxes, some with corners creased from being handled too many times. He didn't share this system with anyone. In that room, he answered to no schedule, no contract, no image. He answered to himself. But the more he poured into that room, the more paranoid he became about what might happen if someone else ever walked in. He'd seen how a single leaked story could be twisted and amplified. He knew how the world fed on scandal, on half-truths, on the most vulnerable parts of a person being turned into headlines. The idea that someone could take these recordings, these private writings, and use them to define him, it unsettled him more than any performance ever could. So the secrecy tightened. He changed where he kept the key. He made sure certain people never even walked down that hallway. If someone asked casually what was behind that door, he'd brush it off with a joke or a quick answer that ended the conversation. Over time, fewer and fewer people even remembered that the door existed. Only one confidant knew the truth, that the room wasn't just storage. It was Elvis's last attempt at owning his story. And then came the turning point. It wasn't one single betrayal, but one day that pulled several threads together and showed him just how little control he had over the outside version of himself. A story surfaced in the media, something personal, twisted just enough to sting. The kind of story that could only have come from someone within his circle. At the same time, he discovered that a financial decision had been made under his name, tied to long-term obligations he wasn't fully aware of. And layered over that, a deeply personal disappointment. Someone he cared for made a choice that left him feeling used, not loved. That day, it felt like everything collided. The public image, the private wounds, the contracts, the whispers. He walked through Graceland, past the rooms everyone knew, past the spaces that held laughter and music and memories. Each step felt heavier than the last. When he reached the hidden door, he didn't hesitate. He unlocked it, stepped inside, and locked it again from the other side. For hours, he stayed in that room. He read old letters, some from just a few years earlier, some from long before fame swallowed his life. He played back the tapes, the younger-sounding Elvis on earlier reels, the more tired, reflective voice on the newer ones. He watched his own thoughts evolve, from open hope to guarded acceptance. Somewhere in the middle of that, he made a decision. It wasn't enough to just store his inner life in this room. He needed to protect it, intentionally, deliberately, in a way that would outlast him. This space wasn't just a diary. It was a message. A record not for tabloids or contracts, but for whoever would one day try to piece together who he really was. He cleared a small space on the desk and took out a box. Not a decorative one, not something ornate, just a simple wooden box that looked plain to anyone who didn't know what it meant. He sat down, took a deep breath, and pulled a sheet of paper toward him. On it he began writing, not song lyrics, not notes, but something closer to a final directive. Thoughts about truth, about how stories get twisted, about how people forget there's a real human being behind the headlines and the stage lights, about the boy from Tupelo who still existed beneath the rhinestones. He didn't rush. He let the words come the way they wanted to. There were cross-outs, pauses, moments when he put his head down and just sat there, listening to the silence of the room. When he finished, he folded the paper carefully and placed it inside the box. Then he added other things, a photograph that mattered more than most people would ever guess. A small item tied to his mother, something from a relationship that left a permanent mark on his heart. Each object was chosen with intention, like he was building a story only the future could read. Finally, he took a pen and wrote on the lid of the box 4 simple words. "Do not open unless I'm gone." It was more than a warning. It was a boundary he hoped would be respected. A line between his present and the future, between what the world demanded and what he needed to leave behind. He placed the box in the room, not on the top shelf, not buried in a corner, but somewhere it would be found if someone eventually understood the significance of this space. When he stepped out and locked the door that night, the room was no longer just a refuge. It was now a sealed chapter. From that point on, every new hurt, every new disappointment, every new realization seemed to push him closer to that room, and further from the people who thought they knew him best. He didn't stop loving them. He didn't stop showing up. But inside, he knew there was now one part of him that no one else could touch. The unraveling of trust on the outside led to the building of something deliberate on the inside. The world saw Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll. Graceland saw the host, the son, the friend, the father. But behind that locked door was the Elvis who existed when the spotlight went dark. And as the years ahead grew heavier, that room would become the silent keeper of a truth he wasn't sure the world was ready to hear. There comes a point in a person's life when the weight they've been carrying so quietly suddenly becomes too heavy to hide. For Elvis Presley, those final years weren't defined by fading fame or declining health the way tabloids like to claim. They were defined by something far more human, a growing awareness that the world no longer saw him, only the myth built around him. And as that awareness grew sharper, the hidden room in Graceland, the one place that held the truth he didn't dare speak aloud, became both a refuge and a reminder of everything slipping out of his control. His health was beginning to betray him, yes, but that wasn't the real pain. The real pain was how people reacted to it. Some whispered behind closed doors. Some used it to push their own agendas. Some pretended they didn't see anything wrong until it benefited them to acknowledge it. Elvis still performed with everything he had left. There were nights when the audience's roar felt like medicine, and nights when the roar felt like pressure he didn't have the strength to withstand. But on the surface, he remained the king. The jumpsuits glimmered, the voice still soared, the legend lived on. Inside, though, the unraveling was accelerating. He felt the distance between who he was and who he was expected to be widening every day. People talked to him like he was an idea, not a man. Advice became demands. Requests became obligations. Some days it felt like he didn't belong to himself anymore. And each time that feeling swept over him, he found himself walking, almost unconsciously, to that locked door. Inside the room he could breathe, but even that breath began to change. The tapes he recorded during those years sounded different from the ones before. His voice was softer, heavier, like he was weighing every word. He spoke less about outside betrayals and more about internal battles, fear, exhaustion, moments of clarity that faded into confusion, and memories that gave him both comfort and pain. One tape, dated just a few months before everything ended, captured something particularly raw. He spoke about the lonely kind of fear, the kind that comes when you're surrounded by people but feel you can't trust a single one of them with what's really going on inside your heart. He talked about the pressure to appear strong, even as he felt pieces of himself slipping. He talked about love, regret, the expectations of millions, and the quiet moments when he felt like a stranger in his own skin. And then he asked, in a voice barely above a whisper, "Who do they see when they look at me now? Because it isn't who I see." It was the most vulnerable he had ever allowed himself to sound. The late-night tapes weren't the only things changing. His writing grew more emotional too, shorter but sharper, like he didn't have the energy for long reflections anymore. Some pages had just a single line, written with shaky urgency. "It's getting harder. Feels like they've all moved ahead without me. I want to be remembered right." He didn't specify what right meant. Maybe he wasn't sure himself. But as his private reflections deepened, the outside world grew louder. Contract negotiations tightened. People debated what Elvis should do next, as if he were a brand instead of a person trying to stay afloat. Even those closest to him, people he still loved, still cared for, didn't always see the cracks forming beneath his surface. And then came the day that pushed everything past a breaking point. A journalist published a piece filled with half-truths and insinuations about Elvis's health, his habits, his emotional state. It wasn't entirely false, but it wasn't remotely fair. It portrayed him as a man spiraling, losing grip, becoming the ghost of the superstar he once was. What pierced him the most wasn't the article itself. It was realizing that the details in it could only have come from someone close enough to know better. Someone who saw him not as a headline, but as a human being, and still chose to feed the public's appetite for tragedy. That betrayal didn't come with shouting or confrontation. It came with silence, a quiet reel of disappointment that settled deep in his chest. That night he unlocked the hidden room, sat down at his desk, and just stared at the tape recorder. His hand hovered over the button, but for the first time in years he didn't press it. Instead, he opened the wooden box, the one marked for after his death. He didn't remove anything. He just looked at the contents, the letters, the photo, the folded pages he'd written, the small personal items that held stories even the closest people in his life didn't know. He touched them carefully, almost reverently, as if making sure they were still there, as if reminding himself of who he used to be, who he wanted to be remembered as. Then he closed the box again and sat back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. This was the quietest fallout of his life. No spectacle, no argument, just a man realizing that the distance between his public image and his private truth had finally become insurmountable. Over the months that followed, this quiet resignation settled into him. He still laughed sometimes, still joked with his inner circle, still showed glimpses of the warmth and generosity everyone knew him for. But those moments were shorter, like brief bursts of sunlight on a winter day. More often he drifted, physically present but emotionally somewhere deeper, somewhere harder to reach. He returned to that room more often, staying longer, writing shorter messages but with more emotion. Some lines read like confessions, some read like apologies, some read like messages to people he hadn't spoken to in years. One page simply said, "I wish they knew the real me." Another, "I hope this room helps them see it." He seemed to understand, long before anyone else did, that the world would forever pick apart his life, his choices, his final years. And he needed something to counter the noise. The room became that counterbalance, a testament, a final statement that only time would reveal. As his health worsened, the tapes grew fewer, the writings grew more scattered, but the visits to the room remained constant. Sometimes he sat in silence. Sometimes he rearranged items like he was preparing the room for someone else to understand it. Sometimes he just stood there, breathing in the stillness he had created. And then there was the final entry, his last addition to the room before his passing. It wasn't a letter, it wasn't a confession, it wasn't even a tape. It was a single object he placed inside the wooden box. Something personal, something symbolic, something meant not for the world, but for whoever had the responsibility, decades later, to unlock that door. No one knows what Elvis thought the moment he added it. No one knows if he believed the room would truly stay sealed. No one knows whether he hoped the contents would change the world's perception of him, or simply give him, finally, the peace he'd been chasing. What is known is this. After placing that final item inside, Elvis closed the lid gently, ran his hand along the top of the box as if saying goodbye, and walked out of the room. He locked the door behind him, and he never opened it again. In the days leading up to his death, Elvis was surrounded by people, staff, friends, family, medical professionals. But emotionally, he seemed further away than ever. His thoughts drifted. His silences grew longer. He moved through Graceland like a man carrying something invisible, something too fragile to speak aloud. And yet there were moments of clarity, moments when he laughed, moments when he showed tenderness, moments when he seemed almost himself again. Those who loved him held onto those moments tightly, not knowing they were gathering the last pieces of him. When he died, grief swept through Graceland like a storm no one knew how to weather. There was shock, sorrow, disbelief, and beneath it all, unanswered questions. What had been going on inside him these last months? What did he carry alone? What would he have wanted people to know? And in the middle of that grief, the hidden room sat silently behind its locked door, waiting. The confidant Elvis had entrusted with instructions all those years earlier honored them. The room was not opened immediately. It was not touched. It was not disturbed. Elvis wanted it opened when it's time, and no one knew what time meant. So the door stayed closed. Days became weeks, weeks became years, years became decades, and the room, untouched, unaltered, became a myth whispered about by people who heard only fragments of the truth. Some said it held scandal. Some said it held secrets that could destroy reputations. Some said Elvis used it to record confessions too painful for the public. But the people closest to him knew one thing. Whatever was behind that door, it wasn't meant to shame him. It was meant to reveal him. The real Elvis. Not the king. Not the icon. Not the myths. The man. And when the modern archivists finally turned that key and opened the door, decades after Elvis last stood inside, the air felt thick with the weight of everything he'd left behind. They saw the tapes, the letters, the arranged memories, the wooden box with his handwriting, and they realized instantly and completely that this room wasn't a hiding place. It was a message to them, to the world, to anyone still trying to understand him after all these years. But the most shocking part wasn't the room itself. It was what they discovered last, something Elvis placed there at the very end, something no one expected, something that would change everything they thought they knew about his final years. And that discovery is where the story turns again. When the door to the hidden room finally opened, the archivists expected history. They expected documents, memorabilia, maybe a few forgotten artifacts from a long career. They did not expect to feel as though they were stepping into the mind of a man who had been misunderstood for most of his life. The air felt still, as if nothing inside had moved since the day Elvis last stood in that room. And maybe that was why everyone went quiet. It wasn't reverence for a celebrity. It was respect for a man who had poured his unspoken truth into this space and trusted time, not people, to reveal it. They began with the letters, carefully unfolding each page like it might crumble under the weight of so many decades. Some were from fans who thanked Elvis for saving their lives with a song. Others were personal notes from friends he'd grown distant from, people who drifted out of his orbit long before his final years. But the most powerful letters were the ones written by Elvis himself, pages he never sent, thoughts he never voiced aloud. One page, dated years before his passing, held a sentence that made one archivist stop reading altogether. "I don't want them to remember the mistakes. I want them to remember the man who kept trying." Another letter, written in a shakier hand, simply said, "I wish I had said more when I had the chance." Each word reframed the last stretch of his life, not as a tragedy, but as a battle he fought quietly, hoping the world would someday understand the weight he carried. Then they found the tapes. Carefully labeled, stacked in chronological order, each reel held the voice the world knew, but in a tone no one had ever heard. There were recordings where Elvis laughed softly at memories, talked about dreams he hadn't given up on, reflected on childhood moments, revisited heartbreaks, and admitted fears he had hidden from everyone around him. But some tapes carried a different tone, still gentle, still vulnerable, but filled with a depth of honesty the world was never allowed to hear. On one tape, he said, "I just hope someday they see more than the costumes. I want them to see me, the real me." Hearing his voice echo through that room felt like a conversation across time. You could almost sense Elvis speaking directly to whoever would one day find these tapes, someone he trusted more than he trusted the people around him. Someone who didn't exist yet, someone who would listen without judgment. That realization settled over everyone. Elvis wasn't just hiding this room from the world. He was saving it for the world. Because for the first time, these recordings made something painfully clear. Elvis Presley never stopped loving his fans, never stopped loving music, never stopped loving the life he had built. What he struggled with was everything that came with it. The expectations, the myth-making, the loss of privacy, the betrayals that chipped away at his spirit. And then they saw the wooden box. It sat where Elvis left it, on a low shelf, slightly forward, almost inviting someone to reach for it. The handwriting on the lid was unmistakably his. "Do not open unless I'm gone." Everyone held their breath as the box was lifted. It was heavier than it looked, suggesting it held more than letters, more than memorabilia, more than grief. They gathered around as it was opened for the first time since Elvis closed it with his own hands. Inside, the items were arranged with care. The first object was a photograph, one worn at the edges, the colors slightly faded. It showed Elvis not on stage, not signing autographs, not posing for a magazine. It showed him smiling, relaxed, his arm around someone he cared deeply for. A moment of genuine happiness, preserved not for the world, but for himself. Next was a small locket. Inside was a picture of his mother, the woman whose influence remained the largest shadow and the greatest comfort throughout his life. He had never spoken publicly about how deeply her passing affected him. But here, in his most private sanctuary, the truth sat quietly, undeniable. Then came a folded piece of paper. Not a note. A letter. It wasn't addressed to anyone specific. The top simply read, "For those who cared." And as they unfolded it, Elvis's voice returned, not through a tape, but through ink shaped into the words he never spoke aloud while he was alive. He wrote about love, not romantic love, but the love he felt from strangers who made him feel understood in a way the people around him often failed to. He wrote about the loneliness of fame, how it separated him from everyday life. He wrote about regret, not for the career choices or the controversies, but for the times he pushed people away when he really needed them close. He wrote about Graceland, calling it, "the only place in the world where I feel like Elvis the man, not Elvis the legend." And then he wrote about the room itself. "This room holds the truth. Not the truth they printed, not the truth they guessed. The truth I couldn't say." One line hit especially hard. "If you're reading this, I hope you see me clearly now. I hope you understand I was trying, always trying, to be worthy of the love I never believed I deserved." It was a confession, a farewell, a plea, and a gift all at once. But the final object in the box, the one added in his final months, was the most unexpected of all. It was a voice reel, unlabeled, untouched since he recorded it. When they later played the tape, it became the emotional centerpiece of everything Elvis had left behind. His voice on this final reel was fragile but calm, filled with acceptance, not despair. He talked about his dreams for the future, even as he admitted he didn't know if he would live long enough to reach them. He reflected on mistakes with a humility that made the room feel smaller. He laughed softly at memories from his childhood. And he ended the tape with a message meant for whoever would hear it when the world was finally ready. "If you're listening, thank you. For remembering me. For caring enough to come this far. I hope you understand now. I was just a man trying to find his place. I hope you find yours too." When the tape ended, no one spoke. The weight of his words lingered, reshaping every narrative ever told about his final years. Elvis Presley had not been spiraling into darkness. He had been searching for peace, intentionally, quietly, and with a clarity no one had given him credit for. The discovery of that room didn't expose scandal. It exposed humanity. It revealed a man who struggled, loved deeply, carried private loneliness, and still tried to give the world his best. It showed someone who feared being misunderstood more than being forgotten. Someone who built a room not to hide in, but to be remembered truthfully. And in the end, that hidden room didn't change his legacy. It completed it. People will always remember the man on stage, the voice, the charisma, the electricity. But now they have the chance to remember the man in that quiet room too. The one who wrote letters he never sent. The one who recorded his fears late at night. The one who held onto objects that grounded him when fame pulled him away from himself. The one who hoped, against all odds, that someone would one day understand the truth he kept tucked behind a locked door. The one who never stopped being human. And maybe that's the shock, the revelation, the lasting impact of opening the room Elvis kept hidden. The king was mortal. The legend was human. And the truth he left behind was far more beautiful than the myth. Because Elvis Presley didn't hide that room out of shame. He hid it out of love. For the people he lost. For the people he hoped would find it. And for the legacy he prayed would survive long after he was gone. Elvis built a room to protect the parts of himself the world was never meant to twist, and now that it's open, his voice finally speaks without interruption. If his hidden truth moved you, tell us. What surprised you the most about the Elvis revealed in this room? Your thoughts keep his real story alive. If you want more deep, emotional explorations like this, like the video, subscribe and share your interpretation below. His legacy lives through conversations like yours.